Hello everyone and welcome to Dr. Daniela Liggett's plenary talk, Small Glimmers of Hope Amidst the Turmoil of a Pandemic, the Implications of COVID-19 for Antarctic Research and Governance. We're very lucky to have Dr. Daniela here today. Dr. Daniela Liggett is a senior lecturer at Gateway Antarctica at the University of Canterbury and is currently the co-chair of SCAR's Standing Committee on Humanities and Social Sciences. She is particularly interested in qualitative research, which crosses different disciplines and challenges conventional research paradigms. Dr. Daniela's research interests include Antarctic environmental governance and human engagement with the polar regions, as well as complex polar futures. She is involved in the Polar Predictions Project Societal and Economic Research Applications, PPPSERA, task team, and has contributed to the UN Environment's Global Environmental Outlook, as well as the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research's first Antarctic and Southern Ocean Horizon Scan. She is currently involved in collaborative research on the topics of Antarctic futures, Antarctic gateway cities, Antarctic heritage, the use and provision of polar environmental forecasts, and Antarctic science policy interactions. In today's talk, Dr. Daniela Liggett will outline an international SCAR community-driven research program that proposes to examine potential impacts of COVID-19 on Antarctic research, operations, and governance. She will also discuss some early results of a rapid risk and opportunity appraisal across the spectrum of human engagement with the Antarctic, with a focus on research, tourism, and governance. Throughout this talk, she'll be talking for about 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A, but during the presentation, you may add your questions to the live Q&A panel, which is just on the right side of your screen. I will be reading those after Dr. Daniela's talk. Thank you, Dr. Daniela.
Thank you, Letitia, for this great presentation. Let me just share my screen with you. So thank you again, Letitia, for your great introduction, and also thank you to the SCAR Conference Organizing Committee for inviting me to speak to you today, and also to give me the freedom to change my originally proposed plenary to one that focuses on an issue that has undoubtedly touched all of us in our work and our personal lives. Some of you will have been more adversely affected than I, sitting here in Christchurch, New Zealand, can possibly imagine. So I want to express my support by dedicating this talk to all of you who have had to make sacrifices or have experienced loss, as much as I wish to dedicate it to the community of scholars, without whose efforts and input I would not be able to give this plenary today. So welcome to you all, and thank you for getting up early or staying up late, or putting other aspects of your life on hold to listen right now. Many of us will be very familiar with the World Health Organization's COVID-19 dashboard, which brings a COVID-19 tracker into our living rooms. Some of us may actually be following COVID-19 trackers like the WHO's almost compulsively. Aside from highlighting the magnitude of the pandemic that has the world in its grasp, I put up this map for a very different reason as well. We can see that the map's projection is rather archaic and colonial in that it emphasizes northern latitudes, making Greenland look as big as Africa, which is disappointing in its own right. However, what is even more striking is the conspicuous absence of the Antarctic continent. And this is not because I trimmed the map at the bottom. It might be because Antarctica is currently still free of the virus. However, this, as we know, does not mean that the pandemic has not had significant repercussions for all forms of human engagement with the Antarctic. We've seen the impact that COVID-19 has had on livelihoods all around the world. We've seen that employment rates have been negatively affected, and employment is only one of many indicators that show the impact of a disaster on people's lives. Our Antarctic communities of practice are interwoven into society, and we too feel the complex and far-reaching impacts of COVID-19 in our multiple and interconnected types of engagement with the Antarctic continent. This is what this presentation and the community-based Antarctic COVID-19 research project is all about. The implications of a global pandemic for how we engage with Antarctica, with each other, and in our institutions have certainly been on the minds of many and have forced a re-examination of our values, our priorities, and our ways of life. It has prompted the Standing Committee on the Humanities and Social Sciences to respond to a suggestion by the SCAR president to look into this topic further. And this is how this project was born. So in this talk, I will briefly touch on the rationale behind this project. We'll talk about its evolution and will then highlight some of the research questions and methods we are using before presenting some first very tentative results of our work and concluding with a look forward. The last few months have seen the news being dominated by COVID-19 related articles, and some of these news stories also feature Antarctica. So Antarctic-based staff, for instance, offered strategies on how best to deal with isolation and boredom for people struggling to cope during local or regional lockdowns, designed to stem the spread of coronavirus. The media also celebrated the COVID-free status of Antarctica in numerous articles, signaling to us the importance to ensure that the continent remains free of the virus. In our professional lives, we've also already experienced a profound impact of COVID-19 on, for instance, staffing or fieldwork. And in Monday's plenary, we've heard Valérie Masson-Delmotte touch on the serious implications the reduced field seasons are likely to have for the sustainability of climate monitoring, including the maintenance of weather stations. We've seen that administratively, SCAR feels the impact of travel restrictions and bans on large gathering. This is evidenced not only in the painful decision to move this conference online, but also in the decision-making processes within SCAR at a time when an in-person delegates meeting cannot go ahead as originally planned. And the SCAR newsletters and the president's briefings that you see here in a screenshot have eloquently summarized some of these difficulties. And all of this fed into the evolution of this community-based research project, which was, as I already indicated, conceived following a suggestion by Stephen Chown. Thank you, Stephen, to look into the impact of COVID-19 on the Antarctic research community. We then called on a small group of scholars with an interest and expertise in current issues related to human engagement with the Antarctic to develop a proposal that responded to Stephen's suggestion. And here I'd like to particularly acknowledge Bob Frame, whose very thoughtful input and mentoring shaped our initial proposal. And by then we had already called for expressions of interest to contribute to the project to our broader community of Antarctic social scientists and humanities scholars. And based on these expressions of interest, we fine-tuned the proposal, which was submitted to SCAR in early May and also received encouraging feedback at that point. And we then determined leaders for 6 different work packages who began to organize their teams while we were also looking for funding, and in this process reached out to a number of organizations. We had a first full team meeting in mid-June and a second one in July, following which we reviewed the project structure and description. And the different work package teams sent us progress reports and early results a few days ago, and those flowed into this presentation that I'm giving right now. As you can probably imagine, without this wonderful team of enthusiastic, supportive, innovative, and open-minded scholars, this project would not exist. And also without the leadership of our team of co-leads for each of the work packages, whose pictures you can see there on the screen and whose names you see before you, we would not have come this far. I will say a bit more about the individual work packages in a minute, but I also want to use the opportunity to acknowledge our project manager, Andrea Herbert, who keeps us organized and also stimulates our thinking. These two word clouds here give you a sense of the geographical and disciplinary diversity of our team, which consists of over 30 researchers, many of whom are early career researchers, and they're an absolutely inspiring group of scholars. Alongside minorities and women, it is actually those early career researchers that were identified as a group that is disproportionately strongly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was done by scholars that published an article in Nature and Ecology and Evolution that I will draw on later, and that also featured in this Nature News career feature. There is a risk of reducing diversity in academic institutions as a result of the pandemic. And we really need to think about how we can best address some of the inequalities that are exacerbated by the pandemic. The discussion on such inequalities formed our overarching research questions, which evolve around the implications of COVID-19 for Antarctic research. And here we speak of research and researchers to include the entire community of practice, which means everyone who contributes to Antarctic research, including base support staff, administrators in national Antarctic programs, funders, and other Antarctic stakeholders with direct links to the research community. Of course, this includes policymakers and the tourism industry. Our work aims at identifying the most vulnerable Antarctic community members and how they are being affected by COVID-19. And we want to understand what assistance would be most valued by those people in the short term, but also the medium and long term. We also intend to look at how internal relationships between researchers are affected within and across SCAR member states. And finally, it will be important to examine the long-term implications of COVID-19 for SCAR's operations and governance. All of the above, of course, necessitates an analysis of external pressures and factors, including within the Antarctic governance regime and tourism industry, which all provide the broader context within which our work and our Antarctic communities of practice are to be positioned. To address these questions, we are drawing on a suite of social science and humanities methods, and these include future scanning, which is a standard technique to collect broad sweeps of global data. They include interviews, which give you more depth and are more manageable with a small group of key players. They include questionnaire surveys with a particular focus on the SCAR community. They also include social media data and media-based analyses that include, for instance, sentiment analysis combined with textual analysis. And they also combine document analysis that covers press releases and published reports and literature reviews to keep up to date with the published scientific literature and discourses. All of the above will be undertaken in different languages besides English, as our broader team has the ability to work across 4 Antarctic treaty languages, plus Mandarin and Arabic. We are a multidisciplinary team of scholars used to work across disciplines as well as transdisciplinarily with external stakeholders, which, as highlighted by a recent OECD report that has a screenshot here, is important when tackling societal challenges during disasters and beyond. Our work is structured within 5 work packages, which are listed here, whose approaches and early findings I'm going to talk about in the remainder of this presentation. Work package 1 focuses on Antarctic governance and futures and addresses 3 distinct questions on, firstly, how the pandemic is shaping global order and geopolitics. Secondly, what risks and opportunities might emerge in a post-COVID world order. And thirdly, what the implications of these changes are for Antarctica's collective governance mechanisms. In light of cancelled diplomatic meetings, what other channels of decision-making are being used or could potentially be used? We also have to analyze what the consequences of delayed or cancelled decision-making meetings are in the near, medium, and longer term not only for Antarctica's future in its own right, but also for SCAR. We need to carefully consider how SCAR can maintain knowledge facilitation and provision of scientific advice and amidst the disruptions in the decision-making structure of Antarctic governance and in an age of fake news. The Work Package 1 team has already undertaken an ambitious and far-reaching scan of the literature in English, Russian, and Spanish. They found that there are indications in the international responses to COVID-19 that move us towards a more divided, conflictual, nationalistic world, in which the nation state plays a more prominent role than it has been in the last decade. We are seeing a worsening of relations between the two biggest economies, the US and China, and a shift towards more aggressive nationalistic tendencies in these countries, along with a decoupling of their economies and an intensifying trade war. While the latter is largely driven by a political rift between two rival powers, it accentuates a trend of deglobalization. This, along with a global recession, is likely to have a lasting flow-on effect on the rest of the world. For instance, on those supply chains that have become more internationalized in the last few decades. International travel and transport businesses are heavily impacted by the pandemic, as we all know, and respond with job cuts and restructuring. The shipping and fishing industries face challenges not only due to quarantine requirements or restrictions on the freedom of movement across borders or shifting consumer demands, but also because of the need to strengthen biosecurity and health and safety measures. In an Antarctic context, we know that a number of national Antarctic programs are being downscaled in the coming season. This is going to impact field research and might result in delays in infrastructure upgrades or maintenance. There are signs, though, that the scaling back of Antarctic programs cannot be generalized across the Antarctic programs, as this piece in the Atlantic that is shown up here on top of the screen emphasizes. While Western Antarctic players are pulling back, China and Russia had, at the time this article was written, not indicated that they would reduce their Antarctic efforts. A Russian expedition, in fact, that had started before the pandemic took hold is currently underway and aims to locate the South Magnetic Pole, which is highlighted in this Russian clipping here. From a Russian perspective, the pandemic showed the negative effects of globalization and open borders during a crisis. In South America, various measures have already been taken by Chile, Argentina, and other states to reduce the risk of the introduction of SARS-CoV-2 to the Antarctic, including the cancellation of tourism trips, the removal of non-essential personnel from Antarctic stations, significantly limiting contact between international bases, establishing strict sanitary protocols, and the restriction of Antarctic air operations, only authorizing logistical or humanitarian support in exceptional circumstances. Let us move on to Work Package 2, which evolves around Antarctic communities of practice. And as a reminder, these include all Antarctic stakeholders directly involved in or supporting Antarctic research. This work package examines how COVID-19 impacts those Antarctic communities of practice. It looks at how these impacts vary according to individuals' career stage, gender, ethnicity, caring responsibilities, and dependence on field work in the near, medium, and longer term. It also considers how and what kind of needs the researchers might have and what kind of assistance would be most valued by researchers. The team will also examine what the longer-term strategic implications of the pandemic are for SCAR and its working practices, including its reliance on busy volunteers. They will also look at how SCAR can draw positives from the pandemic to bring about a step change in how it conducts its business in such a way that promotes its future sustainability. We know that disasters do not affect people equally. Researchers, and this is highlighted in those articles that you see on the screen here, have shown that disasters expose societal vulnerabilities and inequalities in access to resources, capabilities, and opportunities. Certain groups, namely women and minorities, are often particularly vulnerable to the impact of disasters. A recent study by Myers and others in Nature Human Behavior, shown here, surveyed over 4,500 academic faculty members across Europe and the US in April this year, and they found that the average total working hours dropped from 61 hours per week to 54, noting that this is still well and truly above the normally expected working hours of non-academics, with time devoted to research decreasing by 24%. Field scientists report the largest drop in research time, a 30 to 40% decrease. Myers and others also found that female scientists and those with young dependents are disproportionately affected. These findings were echoed by Myers and others in a recent publication in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, shown here, who also indicated that confounding factors included women's propensity to be involved in more hours of service roles at academic institutions than their male counterparts. Importantly, Myers and others also emphasize the fact that early career researchers are disproportionately hard hit by COVID-19. We are all well aware of at least a number of surveys that have been making the rounds over the last few months, including a survey by the International Association for Impact Assessment, which I believe Valérie Masson-Delmotte referred to in her plenary talk on Monday. The IAI's initial survey has shown that the feeling of uncertainty about the future and the social isolation brought along by the pandemic have been the dominant negative impacts on IA members. But that there were also positive aspects, such as the ability to spend more time with family or spending less money, which many of us can relate to as well. Our research team are currently in the process of developing a survey specifically for the Antarctic community, and this survey will be made available to you soon. We kindly ask that all of you please contribute to the survey, because without knowing what the actual effect of COVID-19 has been on you personally and your work and your families, we cannot possibly identify the most appropriate responses to assist those in greatest needs. So the results of the survey will also inform the development of SCAR's new strategic plan. So do watch this space and please contribute to the survey. Let's now move on to work package 3, which focuses on Antarctic tourism and particularly concerns itself with the implications of COVID-19 for the Antarctic tourism industry, now and in a post-pandemic world. We have already seen many news articles about the impact of the pandemic on tourism, including on Antarctic cruise tourism. And the example shown here on the slide is really no exception. Stories such as those about cruise ships dealing with cases of COVID-19 and then searching for a port that will grant them entry are fresh in our memory. These stories also serve as cautionary tales, reminding us to carefully think about how we will manage Antarctic tourism in the future. The team in this work package have divided their work into 3 key themes, which are shown here on the screen. They're looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on Antarctic operations, including on changing practices, aspects of safety, the availability of vessels, the impact of global developments on demand and supply. A second theme focuses on policy and permitting and revolves around environmental management procedures, government responses, and corporate sustainability and responsibility. And then a third theme is dedicated to analyzing media coverage of Antarctic tourism and narratives of Antarctica in a time of a pandemic. They will also look at the marketing of Antarctic tourism in order to contextualize public perceptions of Antarctic tourism. The team have already undertaken a SWOT analysis, and here the possibility of reduced global carbon footprints resulting from reductions in travel and the potential recovery of Antarctic tourist sites, along with an improved visitor experience brought along by lower numbers of tourists, have been identified as strengths. Main weaknesses include the adverse economic impact of the pandemic on the global tourism sector and obviously also on the Antarctic tourism sector, as well as likely increases in operational cost and insurance requirements. COVID-19 does, however, provide some opportunities, not just for tourism, but for our human engagement with Antarctica as a whole, as both Stephen Chown and Stephen Rintoul observed in yesterday's panel discussion. It gives us the opportunity to rethink how we are operating and to re-envision what our priorities are with regard to tourism and its management. We can also rethink how we educate the wider public about Antarctica and climate change without having them visit the Antarctic. There are numerous threats, of course, which the team have identified. A couple of key threats relate first and foremost to the potential introduction of the virus to Antarctica, without us fully understanding the consequences of this and the related change in public perceptions of our engagement with the continent. We also see clear threats regarding the level of funding available to Antarctic research in the future, as well as the level of support that tourism operators can offer to researchers at times of significantly reduced tourist visitation to the continent. Work Package 4 features strongly in some of the research that I've already talked about. The work undertaken by the team here informs all other work packages, simply because it looks at the perceptions of Antarctica amongst the wider public. And it looks at how COVID-19 is affecting the presentation of Antarctica in the media and those public perceptions. This work package considers the Antarctic not only as a protected environment and an internationally governed space, but also as a workplace, an object of scientific investigation and a travel destination. It considers ideas, analogies, and metaphors related to Antarctica that COVID-19 may be reinforcing or challenging. And finally, this work package also looks at public health strategies and how lessons from living in an isolated environment in the Antarctic can potentially influence and feed back into strategies that are being communicated through national governments in their national politics. Work Package 5 forms part of the ongoing work by the Working Group on Wildlife Health Monitoring of the SCAR Expert Group on Birds and Marine Mammals. This group has already undertaken an extensive assessment of the risk of introducing SARS-CoV-2 to the continent. And they also looked at the stability and infectivity of the virus in the Antarctic environment. They have analyzed how susceptible the wildlife may be to the virus, which is a topic that has been the subject of a range of publications. Only a selection are presented here on the screen. And those publications focused on the risks and implications of reverse zoonosis, which involves the transmission of the virus from humans to animals. And those publications also advocate a One Health approach. Work Package 5 has also examined the ecological consequences of the potential introduction of the virus to the Antarctic. Thanks to Julia Diaz, the team have developed a very attractive overview of the potential vectors of SARS-CoV-2 into the Antarctic environment. And as you can see here, the direct interaction between humans and Antarctic wildlife through science or tourism are not the only vectors to be considered, but we also need to think about discards from fishing operations, for instance, or the role sewage can play. The team are already in the process of finalizing the results of their assessment in a scholarly paper, and that should be available in the not too distant future. I had titled this plenary small glimmers of hope amidst the turmoil of a pandemic, followed by a question mark. The research project that I've just outlined and other developments that we are seeing in the Antarctic communities of practice, as many of the talks that we've heard already this week have highlighted, indicate that we can actually replace the question mark with an exclamation mark. We've seen those glimmers of hope in how COVID-19 as a research topic has brought the community together and has given early career researchers access to a network of established social scientists and humanities scholars. It has also built bridges between the CHES community and the expert group on birds and marine mammals in SCAR. It has stimulated us to think about ways to move forward, to rethink what we are doing and how we are doing it. It has prompted us to review the procedures we follow within SCAR and in the broader Antarctic system. As shown here as well. It has highlighted the importance of trust and collective action in a system that relies on collaboration and coordination in the field in the Antarctic as well as in Antarctic geopolitics. It has highlighted some of the vulnerabilities of such a system, but also emphasized the strength of unity and the will of the community of Antarctic researchers to respond by building bridges and looking for opportunities to work with the large amounts of data that have already been collected in previous field campaigns. As you may know, COMNAP has an ongoing project to develop a resource that details existing data and databases in COMNAP member countries that can be tapped into by all Antarctic researchers. And this is an effort that is to be applauded and that I hope Kelly will mention again in the panel that follows this plenary. We were also reminded by the pandemic of existing inequalities in our societies and the need for inclusive research and diversity in the generation of knowledge and scientific expertise in order to produce those high quality innovative science that we in society require. So in short, there are causes for optimism underneath the rather dark clouds of a pandemic that are still looming over us. And despite the disastrous impacts it has had on people's lives, which I certainly do not want to belittle in any way. So let's not lose that momentum and the results of the reflection that we've engaged in as a result of the pandemic. And I know I left you with more questions than answers, but considering how early in our work we are, this is not unexpected. I once again want to acknowledge the wonderful people that have been involved in this research initiative, particularly the theme leaders that are mentioned here. And I also want to acknowledge a number of supporters who have given us some funding already or have promised funding in the future. First and foremost, of course, SCAR, whose executive committee has kindly offered seed funding for this work, which is greatly appreciated. We also have received early career researcher support from the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition and the Trans-Antarctic Association in New Zealand. Thank you to both of these organizations. The University of Canterbury, who of course also supports my work and has offered a lot of in-kind support for this project, has also kindly included our research project in their annual appeal to alumni, which we are very, very grateful for. And of course, the majority of this work has been literally undertaken on the smell of an oily rag. And I do want to acknowledge the dedication of all the researchers involved in this project who have given their time for free. We are, of course, looking for financial support to continue the work on this project. And just imagine what the teams can achieve with access to funding if they already managed to get this far on a very limited budget. So thank you all to all of you involved, and thank you to all of you for listening.
Thank you, Daniela. That was really interesting. Now to turn to some of the questions that we've got from the audience. First question from Anonymous. Can we learn from how other research fields are responding to COVID?
Thank you, Letitia. Have we learned already? I think we are in the process of learning how other research fields are responding to COVID. We've seen those articles that I, for instance, mentioned regarding issues related to diversity in institutions and regarding pressures on especially minorities, women, and early career researchers. We have heard that there are calls for ensuring that this diversity in institutions is being maintained and actively pushed at a time when hiring is actually reducing. We are also in our work, of course, learning from scholarly publications in other fields on geopolitics, for instance. All of that flows into our work. And of course, as we've seen with SCAR ECBAM, they draw on publications in the fields of ecology and biology, looking at reverse zoonosis and impacts of pandemics and how susceptible certain animals and people as well might be to the virus.
Another question coming in from Peter Convey. Some Antarctic species will be exposed to COVID during winter migrations northwards, e.g. skuas and gulls, as the virus is apparently present in sewage outflows, such as in Southern South America. So arguably, it is inevitable that it will reach Antarctica in some way.
Thank you, Letitia, and thank you to the person asking this very contentious question. Of course, we hope that Antarctica will remain COVID-free, but we might have to be realistic and realize that we may have to manage not only how we interact with the Antarctic environment, but also that there might be other vectors of transmission that we cannot really readily manage, as well as we can manage human and equipment transport to the Antarctic. So there's no guarantees. Of course, there is a chance that the virus will arrive in the Antarctic, but it has prompted us to think about our biosecurity measures, for instance, which will not only be of importance and assistance in managing potential introductions of a virus to the Antarctic, but will also help us to reflect on how we can better manage any non-native species introductions to the Antarctic and reduce them and mitigate them potentially.
Thank you. It's a great answer. Anonymous has submitted a question. How will Antarctic research be affected by the potential gaps in knowledge caused by less scientists on the ice this season?
I should say to this question that I am not a climatologist. I'm a social scientist that looks at potential interactions and human engagement with the Antarctic. So I cannot possibly do justice to all the disciplines that require field science and field observations in the Antarctic. But others in previous plenaries have already pointed out that there will be gaps and that the emphasis will be on trying to maintain some of the long-term observations, without which we might have flow-on effects of loss of data or lack of data. And I refer to Valerie, for instance, whose great talk on Monday really highlighted the importance of continued long-term observations for IPCC reports, for instance. So there will be a flow-on effect. And I think there is a call to almost all national Antarctic programs to find a way to ensure some of the most significant long-term observations. But I cannot possibly quantify the impact.
Well, for that one, maybe everyone should continue to tune into the next panel discussion on impacts of COVID-19 on Antarctic research, which is just after this one, and in which Daniela will be the panelist as well. Just mentioning that for people who are interested in just looking into those impacts a bit further. Now we have a question from Gabriela Roldan. In what ways, besides funding, can research institutes and SCAR help early career and minority groups to overcome the shortcomings of the pandemic?
There are multiple ways in which we can help, and not all are just financial. Some of them might relate to, for instance, ensuring that data can be made available to researchers who rely on, for instance, modeling or rely on field data that they cannot collect themselves. But there is a lot of Antarctic data out there in the world, some of it which isn't currently held in databases and has not even been used. And the key here is really to ensure access to data and transfer of data across borders. So to grow together as a community and ensure that you can provide mentoring and access to data to especially early career researchers. Of course, SCAR may also have the option of rewarding good work that early career researchers are undertaking by providing bursaries, for instance, that do not necessarily just require travel to conferences, which used to be the main way we funded and rewarded early career researchers so far, by providing funding to allow them to travel to conferences, and all of that may have to be rethought in the time to come. And we might want to look at how else we can reward, for instance, publication or stimulate research by providing seed funding or bridging doctoral fellowships and scholarships, for instance, if those early career scholars may not be able to get done in time because of the impacts of COVID-19 on their personal lives and also on their work life. So there are multiple options there that should be explored. And of course, I should also add, we have to keep in mind that SCAR itself will be impacted by COVID, and its financial basis might be affected as well, that we cannot even foresee at this point.
Okay, I'll be combining two questions by two anonymous audience members. One is who do you plan to reach with the survey? And also, have you contacted larger and ongoing Antarctic research programs to collaborate with this research beyond participating in the survey?
Thank you for this question. We have, in response to the second question, we have contacted COMNAP. We have also spoken to a number of Antarctic research programs directly, and have shared our proposal with COMNAP as well. We have received several expressions of support, and our team of researchers is spread across the globe, and some of them sit within Antarctic research programs. So that's how we do have access to information from through those channels. In terms of the survey, we want to target primarily with the next survey, the next upcoming survey, the SCAR community of practice. So all of those involved in Antarctic research or supporting Antarctic research. And I don't know whether I should provide more information right now or whether I should just say, watch that space. It will be coming out soon. It is currently in the process of being put through human ethics procedure. You're muted.
Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up there, but everyone thank you to all 149 live participants. This will be recorded as well for people who haven't, who would like to rewatch. And I'd just like to remind everyone again that Daniela will be participating in a joint SCAR-COMNAP panel discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on Antarctic research directly after this talk. So if you're interested in this subject and you want to learn a little bit more, please do tune in. And thank you again, Daniela, for your time and a very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Letitia. And thank you all, and see you in the panel.